the next speaker, who is going to appear on Zoom. In fact, I can see her over here in front of me, Dr. Penny Hawkins. Great pleasure to see her. Dr. Hawkins is the head of the Animals in Science group for the RSPCA, which is, I think, a position she's held since 2015, having worked her way up through the RSPCA since 1996. And in an entry on the internet, she says that when she actually joined the RSPCA in 1996, 3 days before my 30th birthday, she announces, Breathe by the Prodigy was #1, and Tomorrow's World was on primetime BBC One, featuring the latest in traffic cameras. But that, I think, is just a very modest way of introducing herself. She's published extremely widely in the subjects in which she's interested, and today she's going to talk to us on the experience she's gained through her work on animal welfare surveillance. And we very much look forward to hearing her on Zoom, and welcome to Dr. Hawkins. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so sorry not to be there with you. Today, I was taking my 16-year-old out trying to get him to appreciate nature and wildlife, and I jumped over a stream and I broke my heel, so I can't go anywhere. So I've got a real sense of FOMO. I'm sure you've had some great discussions during the breaks. Also, a heads up, I've not only got a broken foot, I've got a cold as well. So if I go muted and for a while, it'll be because I'm coughing or sneezing. I'm so sorry. I'm in a bad way. With that out of the way, I will try and share my screen. You can tell me whether I'll put that in slideshow. Okay, so please somebody tell me if you can't see my oh, I can see on the screen myself. You can see that. Okay, good. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this fascinating meeting, which certainly presented me with a lot of food for thought when I was putting my talk together. I've left some time for questions at the end because I thought there might be some things that you might want to just clarify before it segues on to Jane's talk, because the two talks are complementary. So, as you've heard, my brief was to speak about how animal welfare protection can be institutionalised within government through the development of dedicated governance bodies or policy instruments like welfare surveillance and impact assessments. So I'm going to share my experiences with you, which I hope will be helpful. And here's a brief summary. So yes, I joined the RSPCA in 1996 to the sounds of the Prodigy. I've been a member of 2 statutory advisory bodies, which unfortunately have the same acronym. So the Animals in Science Committee, which was formerly the Animal Procedures Committee, the APC transformed into the ASC in 2013. I was a member till 2015. And now I'm on the Animal Sentience Committee, the other ASC. Just as a point of reference, there actually was somebody else from with a welfare background on the Animals in Science Committee after me, although we need to be careful if we talk about representation, because obviously we sit on these bodies in an independent capacity. We're not sort of representing anything. But there was the person who sat on the Animals in Science Committee who worked for a welfare organisation was my colleague Barney Reid. He was on there until this year, but Dan's right, there's nobody with that direct background on the ASC now, although of course there are people who are sympathetic to animal welfare. So I represented what was then the Animal Procedures Committee in the production of a paper on animal welfare surveillance in 2010, which was written by the liaison group of animal welfare advisory bodies. So this comprised what was then the APC, the Companion Animal Welfare Council, the Farm Animal Welfare Committee, and the Zeus Forum. And then in between my membership of the original ASC and the Animal Sentience Committee, I was also involved in the RSPCA's campaigning and advocacy around the Sentience Bill and the potential for a UK Animal Protection Commission. So this included appearing before EFRA and also helping to convene a joint RSPCA University of Oxford meeting in 2019 on the topic of animal sentience, science, welfare and real world application, which Dan also participated in. And the primary aim for this was to try to cultivate some fertile ground for the Sentience Act. And I know many of us worked very hard to try to achieve a meaningful piece of legislation. So I'm going to begin with my RSPCA hat on. So my day job is concerned with helping animals in science by working to achieve the RSPCA's primary objectives of achieving a global commitment to phasing out animal experiments and replacing these with non-animal methods. So this is the RSPCA's primary and principal goal for lab animals. Meanwhile, while animal use continues, we want to see maximum implementation of the 3 Rs: replacement, reduction and refinement, and robust ethical review of animal use. And as I'm sure you know, there are 3 other science and policy departments in the RSPCA who work to help wild, farmed and companion animals respectively. And within these departments, well, we often discuss between us the many discrepancies between the ways in which animals who have been born into these different groups are viewed and treated, and the legal protections that they have or not, which we've already heard about. So, for example, if we think about a rabbit who's been born in the wild or in a laboratory as a companion animal or on a meat or fur farm, it's obvious that for all these kept individuals, standards for housing, husbandry and care can vary widely, as can standards of welfare assessment. So the Animal Welfare Act does not currently include free-living wild animals. Permitted methods of killing vary considerably for all 4. But as we know, an individual rabbit will have the same basic welfare needs, regardless of where they happen to have been born. Or sometimes within the different RSPCA departments, we'll consider as a group how welfare assessment or killing are practiced across various different contexts and human-animal interactions. Again, as we know, there are some really glaring discrepancies. So a wild fish can legally be killed by suffocation, but this would be illegal in a home or in a laboratory. So from the animal's perspective then, in an ideal world, we will be able to level up and implement standards that meet all animals' needs and enable all animals to have a good life, as opposed to just a life worth living. So what about wild animals is a common refrain. And I think this is addressed neatly in this vision statement by the University's Federation for Animal Welfare. So their vision is a world where the welfare of every animal affected by humans is maximised through a scientific understanding of their needs and how to meet them. And I think that gets around the wild animals issue very neatly. So, of course, the RSPCA is not the only organisation to reflect on the disparity between different groups of animals, and we use that to help inform and drive our advocacy and campaigning work. I know lots of us do that, as the many injustices are so very striking, and again, we've been hearing about those today. So that's where the liaison group of animal welfare advisory bodies came in. So the liaison group's overall functions were to consider any matter relating to animal welfare, to share information on and discuss matters relevant to all sectors, and where appropriate, to organise meetings on these subjects and provide reviews, opinion or advice on them. So it would select overarching animal welfare issues of importance, and then it would nominate members drawn from the constituent bodies to review these. So I was the person from the Animal Procedures Committee that looked at animal welfare surveillance in 2010. So the aims of this group were to review current welfare surveillance interests and initiatives for farmed, lab, companion and wild animals. We had to identify issues and problems, similarities and differences, and then to draw learnings from that could be used to develop sound and practical animal welfare surveillance. It's important to define surveillance here. We did that first off. So by that we meant the systematic observation and assessment and record keeping around the welfare of either an individual animal or a group of animals. So this could be either at an individual establishment, or it could be at a national or central level. And we took an overarching view, which of course was the whole sort of purpose of the group. And we included thinking about the purposes of surveillance. So why would you want to do this? And first, we thought about it at a national level. So a key purpose is to identify the nature and scale of any welfare problems, to track changes in these over time, to do a sort of a benchmark and then see whether things got better or worse, and to prioritise any potential remedial actions. We also recognised, of course, there's a strong public interest in animal welfare, and we viewed surveillance as a kind of a guardianship duty of the government acting for society. Clearly, effective surveillance is also essential to inform government policy and to ensure compliance with regulations, particularly minimum standards of welfare. And then at the establishment level, obviously all of these apply at a smaller scale, but it also enables animal management. And in the case of farmed animals, it can enable assurances to the consumer, for example, within higher welfare schemes for people who choose to eat meat and dairy. So for the analysis, we compared our own ongoing initiatives on the part of the APC, Cork, Fork and Zoos Forum on animal welfare surveillance, looked at the similarities and differences, combined them and suggested an overall risk-based approach to surveillance based on the number of animals affected, the severity of potential welfare challenges to these animals based on their level, frequency and duration, and the feasibility of being able to solve or ameliorate the problem. So we felt that ought to be used to prioritise surveillance goals among different sectors. Personally, I found it to be a very useful and interesting exercise to compare and contrast the issue across our different areas. And of course, this was something that we did regularly within the RSPCA departments, but it was useful to have the perspective of national advisory committees on that too. It was slightly different, but a lot was in common. So obviously, each sector was different with respect to the animal numbers, the settings the animals were kept in, the processes that were applied, all of the infrastructures around their housing management and care. And of course, there were attitudinal and economic factors that come into bear. People's perceptions of these animals vary widely, as I've mentioned, but without really any justification for that. I'm sure that public opinions would differ as to the amount of weighting that we should afford to all of the factors that I've just mentioned, but we did our best to be objective and animal-centric whilst making real-world recommendations. And that's always a difficulty when working in this kind of real-world scenario. You have this tension between wanting to be animal-centric, but also recognising all of the other pressures and forces that come to bear. We did note at the time that all of the constituent bodies, all four national committees, were concerned with kept animals, which we found deeply unsatisfactory given the many conflicts there are between humans and wild animals. And we recommended there should be a body for wild animals that would be comparable to the APC, Cork, Fork and Zoos Forum. And now, of course, there is a wild animal welfare committee, which is very welcome. We also noted that although many companion animals are born at breeding establishments, most live in people's homes where they're kept by amateurs with no routine inspections, which can obviously present problems. I have to say I was very sympathetic to Dan's argument about passing exams before you keep animals when he became our trustee. If that makes you an animal rights activist, then I don't know, there's no hope for this world. So to conclude then, just on this part, the liaison group set out the components of an ideal surveillance system in this discussion paper here that could be broadly applicable and potentially form the basis of a national system for animal welfare surveillance. We acknowledge that, yes, approaches would continue to differ between sectors, and we called for a central body to set an appropriate framework and give advice and guidance about surveillance methods that would be applicable to all. So what happened next? Well, I don't remember hearing anything after that. It's very difficult to find any trace of the group's work now. You can access the 2013 discussion paper on the right on the UK law relating to animal welfare, which also makes some really good points. But I wasn't actually involved in that one. And again, I don't know about any impact there. So my overall conclusion from this is that it can be a useful and thought-provoking exercise to compare any welfare-related issue across different sectors and identify ways to level up and take a central approach to addressing these, but the output can unfortunately easily disappear into a black hole if there are no drivers to achieving impact. So I'm going to fast forward now to the run-up to the Sentience Act. So I'm sure many of you know the background into the introduction of the Act, but briefly, oh, sorry, I need to cough. Oh, so sorry, I can't find the mute button. Okay, briefly, the original Animal Welfare, Sentencing and Recognition of Sentience Bill, if you remember that the sentencing and sentience were originally both together, this was hurriedly drafted in 2017. And this was in response to a public outcry over a misunderstanding of the content of the European Withdrawal Bill. So all amendments to the Withdrawal Bill were voted against, but that was just the whip that MPs were given. They didn't actually vote that animals couldn't feel pain and weren't sentient. However, the public outcry, as I led to this very hasty drafting of a bill in 2017, which was extremely vague. It was really difficult to see how to implement it. Parts of it just didn't make sense. So it was redrafted in order to set out which animals were in scope and to provide more detail on how it would be administered. So as I've mentioned before, many individuals and organisations, us included, were really dedicated to ensuring that a vital opportunity to raise the consideration given to animals and their welfare would not be squandered. And then during this period, the RSPCA and University of Oxford jointly convened this conference, Animal Sentience, Science, Welfare and Real World Application. So this was in May 2019. You can still view the presentations and workshop outcomes online at that URL, and they're really worth a look, even though it was several years ago now. At the time, we and many others were hoping that there would soon be legislation enshrining the concept of animal sentience in law. And we also hoped that an expert independent animal welfare advisory committee would be formed to help ensure that the government received welfare guidance in respect of that law. So we invited a very wide range of stakeholders to the conference, including law and policymakers, trade and industry, academics, animal care professionals, and religious groups. And we took great care to include those with a range of views who would actually test what we were saying, rather than just inviting people within our own sort of animal welfare bubble. And the day included 8 workshops as listed here: achieving behaviour change, harm benefit assessment, policymakers and businesses, animal owners and carers, representation in government systems, sentience in the real world, all areas of industry, and criteria and process. And there's a report from each of the workshops that you can also access at that URL, so still worth a look. Now, interestingly, I think the workshop that's most relevant to today was the one on representation in government systems, which Dan very kindly chaired for us on behalf of the CASJ. And it was interesting that the conclusion was that the major challenges to achieving representation of animal sentience were lack of resource and also a current lack of consensus to what is wrong. That was a point that the group kept pressing home, and what benefits the bill would actually bring. And the consensus of the group, not mine and Dan's, I hasten to say, but it was a democratic process, was that allocating more resources to local governments would enable quick animal welfare wins, including better implementation of the Animal Welfare Act, which is true, but I don't think that obviates the need for a more centralised approach. So this was actually a useful outcome, and it really shows the benefit of inviting people with a range of views, because it helps inform us as to the evidence that we'd need to accumulate and the arguments that we'd need to make, both to support the bill and to achieve some kind of national committee. Also at the time, we were referencing other national committees in countries such as New Zealand and the Netherlands. So the New Zealand National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee advises the Minister on any matter relating to the welfare of animals in New Zealand, including areas where research into the welfare of animals is required. And it also advises on legislative proposals concerning the welfare of animals, with some quite specific tasks around hunting and trapping animals. Now, the Netherlands Council on Animal Affairs deals with issues across the whole spectrum of public policy on animals, including farmed, wild, companion and laboratory animals, although there's also a separate national committee on animals in science that corresponds to the UK Animals in Science Committee. So it's useful to see what other countries are doing and look at these precedents, but I felt that the UK needed its own tailored legislation and committee, and I was uneasy about referring to bodies whose impact was unknown. For example, I personally think that the New Zealand NAWAC looks good on paper, but there are some practices in the country that leave a great deal to be desired from the perspective of animal welfare. And I think it's essential that the UK Animal Sentience Committee can demonstrate impact, which we're going to need to work on. So also on the topic of impact, I had various appearances around about this time before bodies such as EFRA and the Lords. And they were noteworthy because they often generated this standard knee-jerk reaction that a Sentience Act that required all due regard to be given to the welfare of animals as sentient beings would just stop people from doing things that they wanted to do, which is a bad thing. And there was also a perception that it would be implemented to ridiculous extremes. So, for example, an MP at EFRA said to me that obviously he wouldn't be able to eat crabs anymore, to which I responded that people eat sentient animals all the time. And if crabs were included under the Animal Welfare Act, which actually wasn't what we were talking about at all, but anyway, he would still be able to eat them, provided that they were competently and humanely trapped, transported, killed, etc. But that was a knee-jerk. I won't be able to do something that I want to do. The then chair of EFRA was also suggesting that he wouldn't be able to build an extension behind his house because there was a rabbit warren behind it, which was also, I think, deliberate misrepresentation of the reach of the Act. So we were all having to do a lot to talk down all of these misinformed and misleading arguments. And also we had to steer a careful course between explaining how the Act would have a positive impact for animals, but not misstepping and feeding this perception that it would devastate UK PLC and life as we know it. And of course, now we have the Animal Sentience Act, which requires an Animal Sentience Committee to question whether or to what extent the government is having or has had all due regard to the ways in which the policy might have an adverse effect on the welfare of animals as sentient beings, when any government policy is being or has been formulated or implemented, which is quite a wide scope chronologically, which I think is really important. So it's not just about quotes marking people's homework, it's about trying to have an influence in earlier stages. And it includes free living wild animals within its scope, and also decapod crustaceans and cephalopod molluscs on the basis of a report on the evidence for sentience in these invertebrates, which was commissioned by DEFRA and produced by a team at the London School of Economics, headed by Jonathan Birch. I was hugely encouraged by the inclusion of these animals. I think it's so important. Thinking about earlier comments about a cut-off for animal sentience, this was very interesting in the run-up to the bill when we were all trying to think about the scope. And it's interesting, if you want to think about a cut-off, I'd suggest having a look at the LSE report, because this shows you, I haven't got time to go into it now, but it shows you a really helpful list of criteria, sort of cutting edge up to the minute thoughts and approaches about the kinds of criteria that would indicate sentience in an animal based on anatomy, physiology, and behaviour, quite complex behaviours. And you can see that different groups of animals tick different boxes. And now it's being used to look at sentience or the potential for sentience in other invertebrates. Actually, insects, many insects tick quite a few of those boxes. And so do some arachnids. So on the one hand, it's been helpful to validate the scope of the Animal Sentience Act. On the other hand, it's opening up a whole can of worms, which I think is a good thing, that's going to lead to greater consideration for other invertebrates. I think this is just the beginning of thinking about animal sentience. So as it's a sort of a biological phenomenon, there's not going to be a cut-off, but I think it's going to have a major impact on just the sort of philosophy and practice around other animals. Eventually, there's going to be quite a way to go. So now I'm going to put my Animal Sentience Committee hat on. This is our nice new logo that we've just introduced. So you can find the text of the Act and the Animal Sentience Committee terms of reference on the internet. So I won't go into either of these here. I'll just give you a rundown of the remit. So the role of the committee is, as I've said, to consider whether or to what extent, etc. I won't say all of that again. It informs Parliament in this regard, so it actually enables Parliament to hold the government to account with respect to its policies and their impacts on animal welfare. And we don't actually just think about adverse effects on the welfare of animals in practice. We go a bit further than that. We think about whether a policy might have positive implications for animal welfare. So this is important, and we think it's in the spirit of the legislation, and it's also very much in line with public concerns. So by enabling Parliament to hold the government to account, in effect, we're acting like a kind of animal welfare watchdog, and our name can unfortunately lead to misunderstandings about our purpose. Several of us have had stakeholders express the view that they think we're there to sort of pontificate and ponder on which animals might be sentient, or think we sit around defining sentience, which is definitely not what we do. As I've said, it includes cephalopods, decapods, and there is also scope to add other invertebrates by amendment. And as I've said, it'll be really interesting to see how this develops as evidence accrues. So this is the membership. There's me down the bottom. So as you can see, we have a reasonably broad spread of interests, a fair amount of farm animal expertise, but also expertise around wild animals, animal welfare science, and welfare assessment. We've been working together for over a year now, and I think we work well together. So before I go any further, I'll give you an idea as to our criteria when we're judging whether due regard has been paid. And this is pivotal to the implementation of the Act, so it was really important to clarify our thinking around it. These are some, but not all, of the broad factors that we look for. So first off is whether the policymakers actually supplied some form of animal welfare impact assessment, including at least these other elements below. So the criteria and their detail will obviously vary between different policies. So these are just some examples, as I've said. So we look at, for example, did the policymakers conduct or commission research into the scientific literature and current practices relating to animal welfare issues that may arise within the policy? And if they did, this should be adequately robust, for example, using systematic review techniques for the literature, if that's applicable. Did the policymakers consult with a wide range of stakeholders, including the public? And the consultations should be easy to find and understand, easily shared, open for long enough, and directly ask for welfare concerns to be identified and described. I'm sure you've all seen they don't all do this, a few do. Respondents should be asked to provide evidence for any impacts on animal welfare and for practical or economic considerations. Whether the deliberation process around defining the policy was fair and balanced regarding the interests of humans and other sentient animals, including a harm-benefit analysis of the specific case. Also, whether both direct and indirect impacts on animal welfare were considered, including on free-living wild animals, decapods and cephalopods. And importantly, whether due consideration was given to avoiding or reducing harms to animals and minimising the number of sentient animals affected. For example, this could include alternative approaches to achieving the objectives of the policy, for example, reviewing policies in other jurisdictions. And as well as being a component of many animal welfare impact assessments, this criterion also helps to deal with the assumptions that the Act will just stop everything. It's a common sense approach to minimising harms to animals when implementing policies that are deemed to be broadly in the interest of public, other animals or the environment. And if appropriate and necessary, the committee would also look at whether a policy includes effective animal monitoring or surveillance within its implementation, and there should be provision for unforeseen welfare impacts to be detected and addressed. And there should, of course, be adequate resource to implement any protections, safeguards or harm minimisers for animals. And the committee can look at any policy it chooses, regardless of whether the impact on animal welfare is direct or indirect. For example, the Online Safety Act aims to protect adults and children from illegal content, but illegal content includes offences under the Animal Welfare Act. So the OSA will reduce the risk that users encounter live streaming of unnecessary animal suffering. So here's the definition of a policy. You can read that there for yourselves. So this includes existing policies or those at any stage of development, plus subsequent policy implementation decisions. And as I've said, this is really important because we should have a genuine impact, which is best achieved by reviewing policies before they're finalised and not after. And this is what we don't do. We can't recommend new policy which is unrelated to an existing policy decision. So we're not a lobbying group. And the committee should also not duplicate the work of other committees, like the Animals in Science Committee, Welfare at Killing Committee, Zoos Expert Committee, for example, the Animal Welfare Committee. Policies falling within the competence of devolved administrations are not within the committee's remit. And we also have the proviso that was in the original EU Treaty of Lisbon, which requires it respects legislative or administrative provisions and customs relating to religious rights or customs, cultural traditions and regional heritage. So that's a bit of a background as to our remit. I'll tell you a bit about how we work. This is our basic workflow for every policy the committee considers, which looks a bit obvious when you set it out like this. So we identify current or upcoming policy decisions, commission evidence from policy teams, allocate tasks around drafting and publishing reports, and then we review the government's responses to these. And this is our structure. So as I set out earlier, there are 5 members in addition to the chair, and we have a DEFRA-sponsored secretariat to support us. And because we are small, we can be quite agile. We've got the scope to draw on external expertise, either from stakeholders or from relevant subject experts whenever we need to do this. And we've built up an extensive network of stakeholders for ourselves. We've drawn these from a range of different bodies like farming organisations and veterinary professional societies, NGOs, including animal welfare and protection groups. I know there's a couple of you in the audience today. Executive agencies, industry and retail. And each member of the committee liaises with a specific group of these. And we do our best to cultivate a positive working relationship with the policy teams with good two-way engagement. And we meet every 6 weeks, either online or in person. A typical agenda includes a review of current issues and any new policies we might want to look at, which will be assigned to members for triage. And I'll come to this shortly. We look at our process with active policies and we create new groups to work on policies we've decided to look at, ensuring that the Secretariat communicates properly with the policy teams around this. And we discuss ongoing drafts of committee output in the form of our draft reports or letters. And we also discuss our communication strategy with stakeholders, Parliament and policy teams. So at the moment, we produce a newsletter for our stakeholders after every face-to-face meeting. The most recent one actually came out today. So when I finish speaking, I'll forward it to Ben so that he can forward it to all of you in case you haven't seen it. We also contact stakeholders directly in response to specific issues, or sometimes stakeholders will request meetings with us if there's something they're concerned about. Raising awareness in Parliament is very much an ongoing topic, and our stakeholders have recently given us some really helpful ideas around this. It's not always been easy. And sometimes at meetings we have external speakers who give us teach-ins. For example, we've had speakers to give us in-depth guidance on parliamentary procedures, and we've had DEFRA directors or policy team leads in to speak to us. And then again, because we're small, it's easy for all our members to be consulted and have input into opinions and reports. So our discussions generally lead to consensus, if not unanimity, but if they don't, then it's down to the chair's discretion if we have differing opinions. We also regularly discuss how we're all doing with the chair and secretariat because we think it's really important to reflect on our work and our progress. We're a new committee and it was a huge job really to set up our ways of working and get our heads around what we were all supposed to be doing from scratch. And this is how policies come to us. So inputs can include direct media briefings and calls for evidence. The Secretariat also monitor bill lists, and we look at how potential policies might be reported in the media. So there's a variety of routes for policies to come to us. And there's also a direct route on the right in the purple there. Stakeholders can suggest policies they'd like us to review. And sometimes policy teams might themselves come to us for advice at an early stage, which is a very positive thing. And once a policy has been triaged and a decision's been made to review it, the committee will commission evidence from policy teams, which could take the form of more in-person teachings. And we've also developed a pro forma that requests more details on the policy and a summary of the kind of due regard activities that I mentioned earlier. And committee members review the pro forma. We do further background research to help identify both direct and indirect on animal welfare, both positive and negative. And this often opens up further dialogue and information sharing with the policy team, which the working group reviews, again, with help from external experts. So as you can see, we work in a very sort of engaged and collegiate way with the policy teams and with stakeholders. This is the idea that we're sort of a constructive conduit for thought leadership and for thinking around what affects animal welfare and how this can be ameliorated. We're trying to keep everything positive and demonstrate the advantages for humans, animals, and the environment. So this is how we deliver our work. So we have the statutory ability to produce the aforementioned reports. I won't read that out again. And the relevant Secretary of State has the statutory duty to lay a response to any report before Parliament within 3 months, which I think is extremely important and helpful, having sat on committees without that sort of time limit. So it could be the Secretary of State for DEFRA, but it could be any number of other departments as well, depending on the particular policy. As well as official reports, we can also provide policy teams with ad hoc advice, provided that we have the capacity to do that. Then each report has one lead drafter who has a particular interest, and they're supported by at least one other member. So they produce an agreed first draft, and then it's run by the other members in the chair. There's a meeting if necessary. And then, as I mentioned before, if members aren't unanimous, the chair will make a final decision, and the lack of consensus will be noted within the report. And then when the report's been produced, the Secretariat notifies the policy lead that their policy will be reported on. So again, there's no surprises. We're not trying to catch anybody out. We're trying to help people to pay due regard. Then there'll be any number of follow-up discussions, all with the aim of developing and maintaining constructive and positive relationships. So ideally, I think the ultimate aim is that this would help to enable the construction of policies that do pay due regard when first drafted. That would be a fantastic impact for the committee, although it would be a very difficult one to assess and to demonstrate. And after the final report's been signed off, it'll be published on the committee's gov.uk page, and the policy team will be notified. And that's when the clock starts with their 3 months of parliamentary time to support their minister in responding to the report before Parliament. And then the report may also be shared with EFRA and APGOR. So EFRA if it's relevant to DEFRA policy. So the minister's response is typically laid before Parliament as an unnumbered act paper. ASC Secretariat is informed. They notify all the various bodies you can see in the second bullet point there, and the response is also added to the gov.uk page. So the policy teams aren't under obligation to take action following the committee's recommendations, but their relevant Secretary of State may be asked to explain. If not, why not? And this is the committee's website. This is what you'll find on it at the moment. As you can see, some of the reports have government responses there. The response on the Online Safety Act is from the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. The other ones are from DEFRA. There's also a link on that website to contact the Secretariat and ask for the newsletter if you would like to subscribe to that. And then these are our other current methods of communication. So there's the newsletter, stakeholder engagement, also convening stakeholder engagement special events. We held one of those recently and it was really successful. The participants there were very supportive of our ways of working, and we really appreciated the opportunity to engage in person with them too. I think that helped us all to move a step forward. So just to backtrack slightly, I'll tell you how the committee triages potential policies. So we've got a system for this. Once a policy's been selected for triage, it goes to 1 or 2 members for detailed triage and analysis, which is then discussed by the rest of the ASC. If it's going to be analysed, then this is formally logged and the process starts. So the pool of policies that we have to choose from comes mostly from these sources here, policy commitments and pronouncements. It includes calls for evidence from government departments, green and white papers, DEFRA intranet, and also input from stakeholders. And this is how we narrow things down. So if you look at this example long list, you can see examples of primary legislation and consultations, etc., in a range of policy areas, including farming, animal keeping, and the environment. So in this case, an early decision was made not to take the 2 in grey forward for triage. Kew Gardens, because there may have been effects on animal welfare, but these were too tenuous, and dog use, because this did not relate to any ongoing changes or revisions of policy. So we went on to consider the rest for triage proper, and these are the factors that we consider when triaging policy. As you can see, they're just all the sort of common sense factors that anyone interested in animal welfare would consider. They bear considerable resemblance to the animal welfare surveillance factors recommendations back in 2010, apart from the welfare benefits, of course. So obviously, if a policy is wholly beneficial for animals, it wouldn't require in-depth analysis. Just a letter of recognition would probably do for that. And we think about these factors too, excuse me. And we include, we include the potential for animal mortality. Although this needn't be an animal welfare issue, we recognise that this is a public concern. This seems to be what concerns people most about impacts on animals. Will it kill them or will it hurt them? Some of us, me included, believe that directly or indirectly causing the death of an animal who is experiencing a good life is a harm to that animal. It's a significant ethical issue. We also think about whether the issue is otherwise of public interest and whether the policy relates to a novel area for scrutiny regarding animal welfare. So, for example, this could be the welfare of free-living wild animals, which has rarely been considered now, unless they're endangered. And consideration is also given to the likelihood of impact and the overall level of priority of the ASC, bearing in mind that there's a plethora of policies and there's only half a dozen of us. So on that basis, we also rejected registration requirements for bird keepers and the plan for water. I'll give you a brief explanation of this using the plan for water. So when we triage a policy, we use a spreadsheet that we've devised using the criteria I just outlined. There are a lot of columns in this spreadsheet, so the next few slides are just going to set out a brief, simplified version. So first we have a brief overview of the policy. So in this case, it relates to restoring natural water bodies. Animal welfare is not mentioned. Fish health is about as close as it gets. Eradicating invasive species is a particular dilemma where harms to animals are concerned, because in all cases, you've got 2 groups of animals with conflicting needs. So individuals of the invasive species will almost certainly be harmed in some way when they're eradicated, and the indigenous animals themselves could also be harmed during restoration processes. And there are potential animal testing issues, as you see here. But on the other hand, the welfare benefits will be high for indigenous animals once the process is over. And I think this can involve a particularly tricky harm-benefit analysis, because in some ways we're including and weighting the welfare of animals who would not otherwise exist without the restoration. You know, thinking about the indigenous animals who will flourish once the non-native animals are gone. The number of animals is very difficult here, so it's extremely difficult from a situation where animals are kept and you can pretty much count them like a farm. But it is of public interest, and it's also a novel area because it involves free-living wild animals, and freshwater crayfish are also decapod crustaceans, so it could concern them too. But all things considered, the committee afforded this low priority because although if this policy is properly implemented, it would be great and it would be a significant welfare impact, that would happen anyway. And so we couldn't justify working on this when there were other more pressing priorities. So this is what's remaining from that example list I showed you. We're keeping a watching brief on the ones in brown, and we're waiting for a response on the Online Safety Act. We're working on other issues, of course, including animal welfare enforcement, which is a massive and critically important issue. And now that the committee's better established, we're really keen to engage with much larger cross-cutting issues like enforcement or like food security and conservation. So I'm going to switch back and put my RSPCA hat back on again now. So thinking about the original topic for this presentation on institutionalising animal welfare protection within government, here are some concluding thoughts. My leading thought is that this is obviously huge. We all know this. We all have to deal with a plethora of primary and secondary legislations and guidance covering a multitude of species and situations. So every animal who's kept by humans or directly or indirectly affected by human activities should have a good life. But again, we all know that widely different standards and practices become normalised due to people's attitudes and beliefs and economic factors. It will be quite an exercise to research and collate welfare standards across all sectors, let alone enforce and implement comprehensive standards. But of course, this would still be an important vision and an important goal. However, many people, and I won't say the public because there's no such thing here, but many people may not necessarily support equal consideration for all animals, and people's feelings about animal welfare are not always borne out by their behaviour. So, for example, the RSPCA's Kindness Index survey that we run every year, the latest survey has found that 72% of people believe chickens are sentient, but only 38% think that a food strategy that moves away from intensive agricultural methods is an important issue to address. And just 21% state that they purchase higher welfare products. And actually, we found that many factors contribute to people's choices on food, including price, taste, health, habits, and convenience. And animal welfare is not top of the list. Here is also, also from the Kindness Index. This chart shows you people's beliefs around which animals are sentient. So by each species or type of animal, there's a percentage of people who thought they were sentient and who thought they weren't. And the green and red arrows show whether that's gone up and down since last year. Look particularly at the different scores for dogs, chickens, and carp. And there are glaring inconsistencies within people's attitudes to companion animals. Personally, I'll never forget a neighbour of mine who had a pet cat and a pet rabbit and fed the cat on cat food with rabbits in it. So I think achieving consistency and levelling up for different species and types of animal and getting the public behind it too will require some thought leadership as well as reflecting public concerns. Again, I know from my experience with the RSPCA, yes, people are hugely concerned about animals, as is reflected by the size of the RSPCA and the support for it. But I have come to the conclusion that when a lot of people think about animals, what they're thinking about is their companion animals, or sometimes they just mean mammals. But it's still, I think, quite a stretch to get people to extend care to a wider range of species and a wider range of contexts. And I think we all know the reasons for that. So I think, yes, we can safely say that maximising animal welfare as a point of principle is important to many people, as well as, of course, being essential in its own right. But in practice, it'll be important to make sure that any processes towards the further institutionalisation of animal protection will be transparent and engage all stakeholders, and also emphasise the environmental, economic and human welfare benefits, as well as animal welfare. So I hope that doesn't sound too cynical, but I'm just trying to anticipate the real world situation that I know many of us have encountered. However, I will just leave you with this statistic, again from our kindness survey report, to end on a positive. 84% of people feel that animal welfare should be protected by government legislation, and 64% believe that the national government is responsible for animal welfare. So although people might be confused and inconsistent at times, the expectations are still clear. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.